before the committee and speak in opposition to H.R. 5711. And I do so, frankly, because to pass it is to render us less safe. To pass this legislation is to render us less safe. As the committee knows, the sale of commercial aircraft to Iran and the provision of associated services is explicitly provided for in Annex 2 of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which we refer to as the Iran deal. This specific transaction has been carefully reviewed by the Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control to place conditions that minimize risk that the aircraft would be diverted from legitimate civilian aviation purposes. Indeed, I will assert with certainty that if this legislation is to pass, the sale of the airplanes will be shifted from Boeing to Airbus. Now, just stop and apply common sense to what that means. It means the added-on associated services, eyes on the plane that are associated with parts replacement and maintenance will not be done by an American company. Therefore, the prospect that they will be converted into a military use substantially increases, not decreases. And in fact, if we look at the periodic reports of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Iran is complying with its obligations under the deal. And we should not do something that would violate our obligations and lead to the potential collapse of an agreement, which prevents Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons and enhances our own security. If the agreement collapses, Iran will be incentivized to develop nuclear weapons. We will be less safe. But what I really want to do this evening is focus on what I think are the key issues at stake with these two bills: American jobs and our broader economic competitiveness. If we apply the Department of Commerce's formula for calculating jobs supported by exports to the proposed $17.6 billion sale of Boeing aircraft to Iran, we see that this sale could support more than 105,000 family wage manufacturing jobs, the kind where you can buy a home, take annual vacations, have health care, and a secure retirement, and send your kid to college. We have a choice. Either we let a transaction, please hear this phrase, that is fully legal, fully compliant, and without scandal go forward and support American manufacturing, or we let other countries sell those planes to Iran and take that business and those jobs, because those planes will be purchased from someone. Proponents of this bill might say, well, this isn't meant to single out one company. It applies to both Boeing and its competitors. But in practice, it puts American companies at a disadvantage with their foreign competitors. We've previously talked about bills that would have barred Treasury from actually issuing an export license, and in that context, I raised concerns that European manufacturers, unlike U.S. companies, can restructure their supply chain to reduce the U.S. content below where they face review. But if this bill were to become law, European companies wouldn't even need to do that in order to avoid being subject to its provisions. It's easy for a European company to get financing from a European bank if U.S. banks can't participate in a transaction. It's a lot harder for American companies to do the same, particularly if we want them to reinvest that money here in the United States. You know, time and time again, I've heard my colleagues argue that the government should not pick winners and losers. And yet, here we are, singling out and interfering with a legitimate, fully compliant, fully legal, scandal-free business transaction that supports the kind of high-skilled family wage manufacturing jobs we need more of in this country. We are still down 2.5 million manufacturing jobs since the beginning of the Great Recession. On the other bill before the committee being folded in here, H.R. 5715, regarding Ex-Im bank financing, I can only say this isn't belts and suspenders. This is belts and suspenders and stapling your pants to your flesh. Because here's what's real. It is illegal for the Ex-Im to finance a deal to a nation that has been designated a terrorist sponsor, as has Iran. The Ex-Im Bank has said in writing, we're not going to do this deal. Boeing has said in writing, we're not going to do this deal. If this isn't redundant and completely unnecessary, I don't know what is. And oh, by the way, it doesn't have a quorum at the Ex-Im Bank. They can't approve deals of this size anyway. This is all particularly true when the parties to the aircraft transaction say they won't seek EXIM financing, as I have indicated. These bills present some of the starkest contrast I have seen during my time in Congress, between the demands of our economy and our national security and the demands of ideology. I urge you to oppose this legislation. And oh, by the way, just in the interest of efficiency of use of time, the President has just indicated that he's going to veto it. Let's not waste our time on this legislation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Heck. Congressman Henserling, I'm going to recognize you in just a moment because I saw you taking notes in response to things that Mr. Heck was saying, so I want to give you a chance to respond to those. But I do have to say a couple of comments that Mr. Heck made that caught my attention, and I was doing my best to listen very attentively. Now, I can't say with certainty that the sun's going to rise tomorrow morning, but you have great certainty about what this bill is going to do, and I find that very interesting. I know you were here for part of the previous presentation, and I'm curious again to hear how, on the one hand, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle talk so much about the wonderful economy we have, and that you bring forth the fact that we are still down 2.5 million manufacturing jobs since the, quote, Great Recession began. So we do get mixed messages on it, on the economy. Mr. Henserling.
Not from me, Madam Chair.
No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. Mr. Henserling, I think you may want to make some comments in response. I'd like to recognize you.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of different comments. Again, let's be very precise about what we're speaking about, and that is, should the U.S. financial system be opened for these Iranian sales? Should U.S. taxpayers be on the hook? The language of the JCPOA is that this financing is permissive. It is not mandatory. That would be my first point. The second point, where is my good friend, the gentleman from Washington, indicates that somehow this may violate the spirit of the agreement, whatever his precise words were. I don't want to put words into his mouth. But early on, the president himself, President Obama, indicated the Iranians weren't living up to the spirit of the agreement. And if our only concern here is jobs for the U.S., I guess we could begin arms sales to the Assad regime in Syria. We could sell arms to North Korea, and I'm sure we could somehow make money. But you know what? Providing for the common defense is clearly the number one imperative that we have as a Congress, as a nation. So again, this is not interrupting the JCPOA. I wish it was, but it's not. But the question is, should taxpayers be on the hook? Should the U.S. financial system be open here? And it's fascinating to me that when we had a hearing on this, Madam Chair, the Democrats' own witness told our committee, quote, there is substantial risk, as my colleagues have noted, of engaging business in Iran as a general matter and of engaging in this deal specifically. Early on, Madam Chair, the administration itself has said, quote, the administration has not been and is not planning to grant Iran access to the U.S. financial system. So apparently they changed their mind, but it doesn't mean that the U.S. House of Representatives shouldn't be heard on this issue. With respect to EXIM financing, well, maybe it is belt and suspenders, but there are far worse sins than redundancy. And if it's an issue as important as, again, taxpayer backing for these sales, again, it was nowhere in the JCPOA that mandatorily the U.S. financial system had to be open or that U.S. taxpayers had to be on the hook. Those are the two matters that are paramount here. And I believe that the House needs to work its will and be heard on this issue, Madam Chair, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much for amplifying your comments from before. Congressman Cole.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First, I want to go officially on record in favor of the change of my friend, the chairman's title from chairman to secretary. I don't have any say over that, and I'll be supportive of whoever the president-elect chooses, but I'm very glad to see my friend is amongst those being considered for something like that. It just says a lot about what kind of member you are and what you bring to this body and what I think you could bring to the entire country in any position you ever occupied. I mean that with all sincerity. I also want to just make a point quickly here, and I think my friend Mr. Heck would certainly agree with me. I have a lot of respect for Boeing, and I know my friend does too. And I'm very fortunate. I've got 2,200 jobs in my district that they provide. It's going to 3,000. They have major facilities. Nobody does as much to defend the United States of America as this great country, and we have no exporter that's as successful as this country. So it provides lots of jobs. I just want to make clear here, while we have a policy debate here, my friend Mr. Heck makes a very good point that I don't think anybody at Boeing would ever be in favor of anything they thought would jeopardize the security of the United States of America. I don't think they're that kind of company. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, my friend implied that. I know you didn't, but I just want to make that clear. I have a lot of faith in them. I do want to ask my friend, the chairman, to respond to one of the points Mr. Heck made, because it's a good point. Airbus also a great company. They have American jobs, but they're primarily, obviously, overseas. And there would be an alternative market for this, for comparable airplanes. Of course, not as good, but comparable. That probably would be availed. And so, I think my friend made a good point on, look, I trust Boeing people to not be servicing planes that were used inappropriately or in violation. Now, my friend also makes a good point. Look, we use commercial airplanes for military purposes. We transport our own troops in times of emergency with commercial planes. The commercial fleet is a great military asset for the United States, and I'm sure other countries' commercial fleets are potential military assets for them. So, but I'd like him to respond. Are you concerned, or is there anything we could do to make sure they don't get this capability? Because I share my friend's concern about this regime. Look, it's killed hundreds of Americans and done it deliberately, and I detest the agreement that we made with them. I think it was a big-time mistake, but we're here, so I'd like to get my friend's response to that.
Well, I thank the gentleman, number one, for his kind comments. And number two, with respect to the specific question, I would make a couple of different arguments. As the gentleman agrees with me that the JCPOA was a great mistake, I'm not sure that we should necessarily compound that with U.S. taxpayer exposure. So we know what the general rule is. The general rule is that the U.S. financial system is not open to Iran. And the truth is, regardless of Boeing's best intentions, we don't know really what happens to these aircraft once they are released, particularly when it comes to, for example, the leasing and other third-party arrangements. But it could be that particularly when we look at where our national debt is, we don't necessarily know what Iran will do. Will they make good on their payments? So on the one hand, they're going to get the aircraft. I understand that under the JCPOA. But could that be compounded with what could be up to perhaps a $70 billion Iranian bailout, courtesy of the U.S. taxpayer, either through the financial system or through possible XM financing? So I understand the gentleman from Washington's argument, and it is not an invalid argument, but I would say there are other countervailing arguments as well, and I think the House should be heard on the question. Again, do we wish to have all the risk attended with the Iranian financial system, with all of their money laundering, with being the largest state sponsor of terrorism? Do we really want to open the U.S. financial system to this, complete with potential taxpayer bailout? And I think the majority of the House would say no to that question. I think it's an important question. I hope that we're allowed to proceed with this legislation.
I want to give Mr. Heck the chance to respond, but before I do, I want to agree with the gentleman that I do think this bears discussion on the floor. I really do. I think it's a really, really important issue. And the nature of this regime is such that I don't think you can say it's a normal partner, okay? It's not a partner at all to our country or to civilized behavior, in my view, in terms of how it's run and what it does. So, regardless of, you guys both have tremendously good arguments to make and thoughtful, but I certainly would be very supportive of this going to the floor so the full body could weigh in on it, because I think it's important. It's a statement about what we believe, and while we had a chance to make, quote, a statement on the agreement itself that makes this even remotely possible, we didn't have a real chance to vote on it. It wasn't a real treaty, and so we didn't, the normal votes didn't apply, and that disappointed me greatly, and that's why I don't put a lot of credence in what the administration has to say here, because they sort of got this through the back door. If they thought it was a really good case, they'd have taken it to the Senate of the United States as a normal agreement, and we'd had that. But I want to give my friend Mr. Hecht a chance to respond to anything, and again, commend him for the arguments he's made and make it very apparent, and not just because they're in my district, but this is a great company, great American company, has been for generations. And, every time we've had to go to harm's way, and since there's been air power, Boeing has been a huge part of our response. And I just don't think there's anybody who cares more about the country and any company that's done more for it than this particular company. So with that, my friend.
Thank you, sir. Well, 2 points. The first of which is, by my count, I believe my good friend from Texas used the term taxpayer bailout 11 times. I have absolutely no idea where he's getting that phrase. The fact of the matter is this is talking about private financing, not about public financing, because as I indicated earlier, the XM is already prohibited, already said they won't do it. The company's already said they won't access it. And in any event, they don't have a quorum to effect it, even if they wanted to violate law. Secondly, I have to take issue as to what actually is contained in JCPOA as it relates to financing, because Annex 2, which specifically allows for the sale of aircraft, says also and associated services. And I'll read you from Annex 2, Mr. Cole. Associated services means any service, including technical assistance, training, insurance, reinsurance, brokering, transportation, or financial service. So the JCPOA does, in fact, allow for this. We are therefore, in fact, changing the terms of the JCPOA, which is why the administration has raised the red flag, as this is undercutting it. And again, I will get back to where I began, because while I spent the bulk of my time talking about jobs and the impact on the environment, I started out by saying, we pass this, we're less safe. If we repeal JCPOA or destroy it, we're less safe. If we allow Airbus to sell them these planes and not be monitored by American eyes, American hands, we will be less safe.
Okay, with that, I yield back, Madam Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. Mr. McGovern.
Yeah, Madam Chair, if I neglected to do this, the previous bill, I wanted to ask unanimous consent to submit the statement of Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas on some amendments she offered to H.R. 5982. If we could.
Without objection.
And I want to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record, Mr. Heck referred to it, the statement of administration policy that says if the President were presented with H.R. 5711, he would veto the bill.
Without objection.
And, and I would, the gentleman from Texas said he hopes that the House will have an opportunity to be able to debate this on the floor. Well, let me remove any mystery. We are going to bring this to the floor because you guys are in charge. And you regularly bring bills to the floor that I think are a waste of time. I think this is a waste of time. And you regularly deny the minority the opportunity to bring amendments or any legislation that we think is important. And I guess that's your, you have the power to do that since you're in charge. But there's, this is coming to the floor, unfortunately, and we all know the outcome. And if people want to be heard, they can speak all they want, whether in this committee, to the C-SPAN cameras, to the 3 people that are watching this, or to on the House floor. But there's no mystery here. You're in charge. You can do whatever you want. And so understand this will be vetoed, and another exercise in doing things that don't matter when there are so many other things that we ought to be doing. So having said that, I yield back my time. I appreciate the opportunity to be recognized.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. Mr. Woodall. No question, Dr. Burgess. Mr. Byrne. Well, gentlemen, we thank you very much, and please leave your statements for the record. for the